news into CNN. We have new details about what happened after that fiery Oval Office meeting between President Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. We're learning from CNN's Kevin Liptak and Kit Marr that President Trump and Zelensky went to separate rooms after their exchange, with the Ukrainians actually wanting the talks to continue. But as we hear from a White House official, the White House made it clear that it was time for them to go, Trump ordering the Ukrainians to be told to leave.
So kicked out, essentially, right?
Yeah.
Let's listen to part of this moment in the Oval Office.
You're gambling with World War III. You're gambling with World War III. And what you're doing is very disrespectful to the country, this country. That's back to you far more than a lot of people said they should have.
Have you said thank you once? This entire meeting? No, in this entire meeting, have you said thank you? You went to Pennsylvania and campaigned for the opposition in October. Offer some words of appreciation for the United States of America and the president who's trying to save your country.
Let's go now to Nick Payton-Walsh, our chief international security correspondent, who is in Kyiv. And what we're learning here, Nick, from reporting from our Kevin Liptak, is essentially that Trump kicked Zelensky and the Ukrainian delegation out of the White House. Tell us, though, what you are learning. I know you have some brand new reporting.
Yeah, a U.S. official I've been speaking to, familiar with the Ukraine negotiations, who observed, obviously, like pretty much everyone, this meeting, said that they felt things might go awry as soon as Zelensky got out of the car wearing his trademark shirt with the Ukrainian emblem there. We've seen him wearing green T-shirts for years. He's recently started wearing black, longer sleeve shirts more often, rather than a suit. I should point out that his chief of staff, Andrei Yermak, was seen wearing a suit. He's not often seen in that clothing either. They've been adopting sort of military-style fatigue since the beginning of this war, often appearing alongside European leaders to emphasize the point that they are at war in official diplomatic meetings. The official I spoke to saying, I know it's his thing, but this moment is different. And then the official says, in their feeling and interpretation of this, that Zelensky should have handled this differently. When Vance sat down, he should have taken a more conciliatory approach. Now is not the time to quibble or correct the Vice President or the President of the United States. Remember, in previous meetings, you see in exactly the same situation, Emmanuel Macron of France, Keir Starmer of the United Kingdom, Prime Minister, have corrected Trump when it came to aid, but the tone of the correction and the spirit of the meeting was entirely different, much more convivial. This appears to have sparked, I think it's fair to say, an unexpected intervention from J.D. Vance, the Vice President. We've seen him in previous meetings, and indeed, those meetings, he wasn't as vocal. He definitely interjected here, and that seemed to be when things got particularly feisty.
Nick, it's about 20 minutes after 9 p.m. where you are in Kyiv. Are Ukrainians aware of what just unfolded at the White House?
Yeah, this is changing the course of this nation. And there are now kitchen table conversations, people in bars before curfew hits in here in the capital, some with their heads in their hands, I'm sure, a sense of indignation perhaps at the way their president was treated there. There were times when he was not allowed to speak, lectured by the vice president. And I think it's important to remember Ukrainians have lost people close to them, lived under bombardment for 3 years. And you know, I think feel that sacrifice is something they would like to see respected. But here, I think their president was very much expected to take the ingratiating tone we've seen the French and UK leaders take in the past week or so. And at times, I think maybe didn't read the room in that way. And certainly things did spiral out of control. But there are many Ukrainians here deeply anxious about what this means. It didn't just go badly. He got thrown out of the White House and the rare earth minerals deal, which, look, we've been told, most people understand if that isn't signed, aid is significantly in doubt, may stop entirely. That wasn't signed either. And so we are, as that US official I spoke to said, in, quote, new territory at the moment. Nobody really thought it could be this bad, and nobody really, I think, understands what this means going forwards, except that things will be significantly different. Watch the front lines now. That's where we may start seeing this having its greatest impact.
Yeah, this was a disaster. Let's go now to Evelyn Farkas, former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. Evelyn, can you sort of point to the moment where where the tipping point was such that this went off the rails, and now this alliance is in question? The American place in this world order is in question?
Yeah, I mean, Brianna, it's a combination of substance and style, right? I mean, they were disagreeing over substance, but I think where it went off the rails is on the style side, because the vice president interjected, and then you had the two most powerful people in the world ganging up on someone, a leader, really truly the only international leader who's spoken so clearly about universal values, about sovereignty, about freedom. Over the last decades, frankly, he's the one that stands out as being Churchillian, and he's being ganged up upon in a moment of, vulnerability, if you will, publicly. I've never felt more embarrassed and kind of humiliated for my country, because that's not how you treat anyone, much less Vladimir Zelensky. So I think it was the substance more than the style more than the substance. Of course, there were substantive disagreements, and those would have probably remained. But the style is really what I think is shocking to all of us.
We're also joined now by Chief National Security Correspondent Alex Marquardt and Michael Bosticue, a former spokesperson for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, as well as Admiral James Stavridis, former NATO Supreme Allied Commander, retired former NATO Supreme Allied Commander. Thank you all for being with us. Alex, first to you, to Evelyn's point about style. We just heard this reporting from Nick Payton Walsh. The distaste for Volodymyr Zelensky and his military garb, right? He was asked about why he wasn't wearing a suit. Not something of extreme importance there, but it did strike me when we just heard that audio again from J.D. Vance and his exchanges with the Ukrainian president. He pointed out that Zelensky, in Vance's words, campaigned for the opposition.
Yeah.
So their dislike for Zelensky, and he was trying to correct J.D. Vance, they're saying, I don't know what you're talking about. Their dislike for Zelensky is personal.
Yeah, it runs pretty deep, and what he's referring to is a stop that Volodymyr Zelensky made during the heat of the campaign, at the end of the campaign season in Pennsylvania, at a munitions factory, accompanied by Democrats, and that was seen as partisan and campaigning against Donald Trump. So clearly he didn't take that well. Vance was also seemingly affronted by the lack of thanks from Volodymyr Zelensky in that meeting. We have to emphasize that Zelensky has said thank you repeatedly over the course of the past 3 years. He's often coupled that with, and we need more. This notion of his fashion rubbing them the wrong way, I mean, these Ukrainian officials, Zelensky foremost among them, wearing that to remind everybody else that they're still at war. And it is sometimes very notable when everybody else is dressed in a suit and he's meeting these big fancy foreign leaders. But that is the point there. I am struck by the fact that Volodymyr Zelensky first came to the White House in his first foreign trip just over 2 years ago in December of 2022. And it was a huge deal at the time because it was the first time he had left the country while his country has been at war. He was, of course, welcomed as the leader of a country at war and as a hero. And here he is just over 2 years later being kicked off of the White House lawn. It is just extraordinary. And as the dust settles a bit on this shock, I think we have to think about what happens next. Unless there's some Hail Mary effort to mend ties this afternoon, we will see Zelensky go back to Ukraine. The Europeans certainly will be scrambling to try to smooth things over. Before today's meeting was even started, there was a meeting that was being called for by the Brits on Sunday. Certainly now there is added importance to that. They'll be trying to figure out how best to proceed, what way the Europeans can act as a mediator. I have been trying to speak to as many people as possible to get some reaction. There's a lot of hesitance to react. I think no one wants to rock the boat any further. I did hear from a European diplomat who said, I'm shocked. I've never seen such a barrage of accusations against the leader of a country that has been attacked by an aggressor state. And I think that is a very common reaction that we're hearing right now.
And we have some new reporting in from Caitlin Collins that is painting an incredible picture. And we'll try to get her up so we can talk to her a little bit more about it as she's available. But it says after President Trump and Zelensky got into an extraordinary shouting match, Trump was huddling with key advisors immediately afterward inside the Oval Office, and according to a White House official, Trump consulted with his vice president, his Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Treasury Secretary, and other top advisors in the dramatic showdown where Trump and Vance accused Zelensky of being ungrateful for U.S. aid. And that was when Trump ultimately decided Zelensky wasn't in a place to negotiate. He then directed Rubio and his national security advisor, Mike Waltz, to deliver the message that it was time to go.
Yeah, and in a really telling part of this reporting from Caitlin Collins, the Ukrainians were holding nearby in a separate room. This is standard when foreign leaders visit the White House. Typically, they go into these other rooms and they'll reconvene for lunch. But the Ukrainians were essentially told they had to leave over their protest. They wanted to continue the talks. They were told no. And a fascinating detail here, as the prepared food sat nearby on carts in the hallway outside the press secretary's office, Ukrainians were instructed to leave. They weren't even offered lunch. They were just kicked out of the White House after that meeting.
It's an incredible vignette that she paints there with her reporting. Let's bring in Michael Bosserque, who is the former spokesperson for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And Michael, I think one of the things we have to zero in on here is that idea of Vance saying and Trump clearly agreeing, why wasn't Zelensky more grateful? Because what it tells us is that there's this sense coming from the Trump administration, certainly from Trump, that it's almost as if the U.S. is doing charity here, that it doesn't have a stake in the war. This doesn't affect Americans. The outcome does not have ramifications for the U.S. You started to hear Volodymyr Zelensky trying to say, you will feel this. And Trump was almost triggered by that, pushing back, do not tell us what we're going to feel. We're going to feel fine or something like that. What do you say to that, this idea that the U.S. doesn't really have a dog in this fight?
Yeah, well, it does. It has a huge stake. And by the way, as we're speaking right now, there are explosions outside because air defense systems are trying to repel a huge swarm of Russian drones. It's almost as if it started on cue after the Ukrainians left the White House. But having said that, and I'm safe, so don't worry. But the Ukrainians have been telling me and a lot of others, Zelensky screaming at the top of his voice that, no, we're not just, defending Ukraine's integrity and sovereignty, but we're also fighting for the rules-based international order, for European security, for American security. And, here I am in Odessa, World Port Odessa. It ships food all over the world, especially wheat. And I think a problem here is that perhaps earlier on, that argument wasn't articulated well enough that the West has a lot to lose should Ukraine stop being a viable economic entity. Of course, the other thing the Ukrainians like to remind the Americans whenever they can is that it's not as if, and it wasn't, 360 billion, it was about half of that, but it's not as if this cash was put on pallets and flown by military aircraft to Ukraine. A lot of it stayed in the United States, creating wealth, creating jobs. A lot of the equipment was due to be mothballed, but it was sent here. So that's what, and the other thing I'm seeing right now from Ukrainians is they're still absorbing this because they can't believe what just happened. But what you see on Ukrainian language Telegram channels are people trading words of support from people like Donald Tusk in Poland, Spain, and France. There's, I think, a sense right now that let's huddle together. But finally, silver lining, if we can call it that, for Zelensky is he will come back a hero, I think, after everyone sees how he stood up to what's supposed to be the defender of the free world.
I just want to point out we have now gotten a statement from President Zelensky, and he seems to be answering that demand from J.D. Vance that he expressed gratitude. Zelensky here posting on social media, quote, "Thank you, America. Thank you for your support. Thank you for this visit. Thank you, President Trump, Congress, and the American people. Ukraine needs just and lasting peace, and we are working exactly for that." Really telling words, the president of Ukraine repeating thank you multiple times in this statement. I do want to go to Admiral Stavridis, who is with us. Admiral, to the point that Brianna and Michael Bosserque were just making, Zelensky here was trying to express that Vladimir Putin's aspirations go beyond Ukraine. And he sort of made the case that the U.S. may have this big, beautiful ocean, as he described it, that keeps us isolated from some of Europe's problems, but eventually the U.S. will feel the sting of letting Vladimir Putin act as he wishes. Trump seemed to dismiss that.
History will tell you, and by the way, I know this because I'm an admiral, sooner or later they come across the ocean for you, just like the Japanese Empire did on the 7th of December. Those oceans are big and beautiful. I can attest to that, having spent a lifetime on them. They are not going to protect us from the kind of global intervention by an adventurous Vladimir Putin. So point one is, I think Zelensky got the better of that argument. Point two to be made here is, okay, what happens now? I'm reminded of Senator John McCain, who I think would have some pretty strong views on all this. McCain used to say, it always looks darkest before it goes completely black. And I kind of feel that way coming out of this meeting in terms of U.S. support to Ukraine. Perhaps something can be salvaged. I'm hopeful Mike Waltz, Marco Rubio, and others will try and do so. But it feels very dark for U.S. support. And that creates longer-term knock-on effects on our security. And then third and finally, Boris and Brianna, I think it's worth saying that this is going to put real pressure on NATO, on the idea of a NATO alliance. As a former Supreme Allied Commander, this is dismaying inside Brussels because it's such a sharp division between the United States and our European allies. Maybe that transatlantic bridge isn't about to break completely, but boy, can I hear it creaking right now.
What stops it from breaking, Admiral?
Good faith on the part of all of the 32 members. If I were Secretary General Mark Rutte right now, I would call a NATO meeting, bring the ambassadors together, and perhaps press for a summit. This is a moment of real crisis for the NATO alliance. That's another indication of the knock-on danger here. So let's watch what happens at this Sunday meeting of the Europeans. I'll close with this, a little ray of light in all this. If the United States were to simply stop supporting Ukraine, let's not forget, collectively, the European economy is 5 times the size of Russia. Their defense spending is 3 times the size of Russia. They can provide an awful lot of assistance. They can make up for a U.S. that walks away. Boy, do I hope we don't get to that point. That's when the transatlantic bridge breaks.
All right, Admiral Stavridis, thank you for that. And thank you to everyone who joined us for this discussion. We have much more ahead. We'll be right back.